Thank you very much, Virginia, and thank you, Samantha, for that really eye-opening and in-depth presentation. It was very moving. Before I would begin, though, I too would like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Boorong people, and I'd like to acknowledge them as the custodians of the land I'm on for thousands of years. I also pay my respects to their elders past and present and emerging, and my respects to the traditional owners of lands where you may be coming from. I'm particularly proud to speak on behalf of Monash University today because of this project and the work that's being conducted by Monash University Accident Research Centre, or as we like to say, MUARC. It really is the epitome of Monash's mission statement. We have a very strong mission statement. If you don't like it, change it. We're interested in changing things for good. I'm sure all of us would agree that great research and education can lead to positive and lasting change. And at Monash, we're very fortunate to be able to work with such excellent partners in industry and government to tackle really the social and health challenges of our times. We know that over 6,000 people are hospitalised following a road crash in Victoria each year, with 62% being drivers and passengers of cars. We also know that the road, as we've just seen, to recovery from serious road crash injury is often long and complex, with significant impacts on a person's quality of life and significant wider impacts on their families and broader community. Clearly, we need to do more to prevent serious injuries from road crashes. This landmark study that you're about to hear from Michael, which involved extensive community engagement across Victoria and represents the TAC's largest ever investment in MUARC research, has provided us today with crucial insights into the factors behind these serious road trauma injuries, including driver compliance, vehicle safety, road infrastructure, and speed limits. And what we now know is that compliant drivers are often unsupported by the poor safety of vehicles, and this is exacerbated by a fundamental mismatch between the road infrastructure and speed limits where much of the trauma occurs, particularly in regional and rural Victoria. The study has demonstrated that vehicle safety is just so important. Because of the high impact of speeds often involved with these crashes, even drivers compliant with the speed limit, it's been found, or we've found, are not protected from serious injury. Even the best available cars are demonstrating that they cannot cope. I'm sure that this research will play a key role in reducing the number of people killed and injured on our roads. We know that regulation based on evidence-based research promotes safety and saves lives on our roads. This report provides the science and the insight that can help drive the Victorian and national road safety strategies that are currently being developed. As always at Monash, the research has brought together multiple disciplines and experts, including from, but not least, nursing, psychology, engineering, and medicine. This is an incredibly powerful combination of disciplinary expertise and insight into this phenomena. It was not only interdisciplinary, highly innovative too. The team at Monash reconstructed crashes in forensic detail and created roads in a 3D setting. There are, of course, too many project partners for me to name, including our international partners across the US, UK, and Sweden. But I'd like to make special mention of the TAC, Alfred Health, and the Royal Melbourne Hospital, who each have played a pivotal role in this project, and we wouldn't have the findings that we have today without them. Monash is incredibly proud of our work at MUARC and what MUARC's doing, and it's rightly earned its global esteem for informing a raft of policy changes and interventions that have reduced fatalities and injury on roads. For over 30 years, MUARC has worked together with the Victorian Government, the TAC, Vic Roads and the Victorian Police to implement world-leading and life-saving road safety initiatives, just to name a few crucial campaigns such as Arrive Alive and the Booze and Drugs Bus programs, which have kept the Victorian road fatality rate actually to one of the lowest in the world, and that's something we should all be proud of. We actually estimate at Monash that as many as 15,000 lives have been saved since the establishment of MUARC because of its world-leading research and partnership with government and industry so that that research is translated, and that is critical. This incredible project, which you're going to hear more about, will surely add to MUARC's legacy. The findings from the study and the way that it will no doubt inform government policy both here and abroad will help us with our shared global ambition to halve the number of global deaths and injuries from road traffic accidents, which of course is a key target with the Global Sustainable Development Goals that all nations have signed up to. In closing, I'd like to extend a big thank you to the Victorian Government and in particular, the Chief Executive Officer of the Transport Accident Commission, Joe Calafiore, who you heard from just before. We're very grateful and we're grateful for the Victorian Government's significant investment in this project that we hope will save many lives. Congratulations again to the project lead, Associate Professor Michael Fitzharris, the whole team and all the project partners. This is really incredible work and it will again have lasting impact. I'd now like to invite Michael to deliver a presentation on this incredible study. Thank you. Thanks, Virginia.
Thank you, Professor Brown. I'm here in a position of great privilege today, representing many partners, representing Monash University and MUARC. But I do have to acknowledge up front the support of the TAC, Joe Calafiore, the CEO, the partners at the hospital, the Alfred, the Royal Melbourne, Mark Fitzgerald, Professor Rodney Judson. And I'd like to also extend my sincere acknowledgement to Samantha Cofield, Michael Newestig and Antonia de Cavallo. There are so many people to thank and we'll come to that. And I think one of the really important things is this study. I stand here representing a team of people. So I just, and we will acknowledge everyone involved at the very end. But I think one of the really important group of people to acknowledge the most are the people who, at a time of their life and that of their family, that were going through probably the most traumatic, one of the most traumatic experiences that one could ever go through, that they will ever go through, that they agreed to participate in this research study voluntarily, and that's extraordinary. We had a great research nurse team, worked very closely at the hospitals, but for the families of those involved, we owe an enormous deal of gratitude and debt, and I think one of the most important things is to use the findings that we've been able to create out of this research to make sure things happen and that everyone gets home safely, on time, every time. That's the most important thing, and that's the commitment that Monash and MUARC makes, and we hope that the findings are seen in that light. As has already been discussed by Samantha and Joe, the rationale for ECIS is really quite clear. Serious injury is associated with very significant, profound physical and mental health impacts for the individual involved and for the family. The ripple effect is just enormous. It's a lifelong challenge for many people. They confront many issues ranging from time out of work for a short period, for a long period and sometimes permanently, but that's just the beginning. Living with a life of pain, of memory, of legacy of the crash. And I think that's one of the really profound things that we want to talk about and change the conversation from talking about the number of people killed, which absolute tragedy is a very small part of the total size of road trauma. And we know that around 7,000 people are admitted to hospital each year and 4,000 of those are seriously injured. And Samantha showed you the profound impacts of a personal narrative of those particular people and what they do experience. And as we know, the TAC and the Victorian Government has committed to eliminating serious injury in the long term. And that's a really profound and significant challenge that they've laid down for the Victorian community. And it's something that we should all aspire to. And that's really the spirit in which ECIS was created. And it was really designed to give the road safety partners and the TAC the insight, the intelligence that is really required to say, is this possible? It's a really challenging and quite an extraordinary commitment to say, we will reduce and eliminate serious injury in the long run, but how do we do it? So I think one of the things that we really wanted to do was to really understand how crashes happen, and we set about this task. We started with the idea, we built a team of people out at Monash and at the Alfred and the Royal Melbourne, and really the idea was that we would look, as Virginia has said, forensically at the 400 drivers who are seriously injured, and the intention was 400 crashes, and I'll come to that in a second. Really the idea was to look at, well, what are the factors associated with the occurrence of crashes? Because we always have this idea that, well, you know, we have to prevent every crash. But really what we want to look at too is the factors associated with injury severity. Samantha gave a really great rundown of MAS 3+ injuries and how we conceive of serious injuries, and I'll provide examples of that. But it's part of the idea is, what can we do? Once we've discovered the factors that are related to crashes, why they happen, how they happen, and in what contexts, how we understand injury severity, how can we put all the pieces of the puzzle together so we can create a narrative, create the evidence base and the insight that's needed to really look at occupants and preventing them being seriously injured, given that crashes we sense will continue to occur. We want to look at crash prevention measures, but with the goal of eliminating serious injury, that's what we're really guided by. So with the funding, thank you to the TAC board. It's an enormous commitment. Very grateful. One of the things that we set about doing was we created a program where we would look at crashes, as we say, in great detail, in forensic detail. But we also wanted to have a look at questions around speed. Speed and its role that it plays, but as I say, looking at the factors that get people into crashes. So how do they happen? What are the factors that are related? So we wanted to create that evidence base. So we started at the hospitals, the Alfred and the Royal Melbourne. Our ECIS research nurse team would approach potential participants, injured people or their family, while they were in hospital at a medically appropriate time to do so. Our goal was to enrol 400 injured drivers and to see that as a way of gaining insight into each of the crashes. And we conducted this over a 28-month period, which is a substantial period of time. We had our first injured person enrolled into the study in August 2014, and our final person was enrolled into the ECIS case arm, the crash investigation element, on the 6th of December in 2016. Over the same period, there were nearly over 6,500 drivers admitted to the Victorian hospitals across the state and had made a claim. So one of the ideas that we had was, what can we learn that we can then roll up? So what lessons can we learn from the one crash and how many might they apply to? And we're doing some work in that space as well. But the idea of think of one to many, what are the insights that we can apply across all of the crashes? And for detail, one of the things that we saw is at the Alfred and the Royal Melbourne, there were 1,400 people who presented through the emergency departments in that particular time. So they were people who were potentially eligible for our study, and we had a quite strict exclusion criteria. So of the people who were actually eligible for the studies, in that they were admitted for at least one day into either the Melbourne or the Alfred, we actually, the nursing team, managed to enrol just under half of the people who were eligible and consented into the study, 67%. And that's a testament to both the commitment of the people involved, because they see it as an opportunity, saw the study as an opportunity that it didn't happen to someone else. And I think that's some of the most important thing, because being a voluntary study at the particular time of their life, their commitment and their motivation for being involved in the study was, yes, we need to learn so it doesn't happen to someone else. And I think that's a really profound legacy that they leave us with, all the information. I think the second part of the study is what we call the control arm. And I'll come to the detail of that in the next couple of slides. But what we sought to do there was to measure the speed of people who had driven through the same site of a crash on the same day of the week, obviously a couple of weeks later, to the best that we could at the same time of the day, within a 30-minute window either side. And the goal really was to look at the factors that would be associated with people being involved in the crash, and those that are not. And of course, vehicle speed is a major part of that, and we have some very significant findings of that to present to you today. We did have a response rate that equates to, across the 228 sites, of 33%. So in a sense, the ECIS study is structured as a case control study, but our case arm gives us significant insight into how crashes occur. Just a little bit of detail about that. So you'll see our research nurses, as I've already explained, seek participation. They approach the injured person, the injured driver, or their next of kin, and seek enrolment and participation in the study. And the idea was for the ECIS research nurses to interview the injured person about the events of the crash, but also where the person was so significantly injured was to obtain consent from the next of kin, so we could still understand those most serious crashes at the upper end, which Samantha had shown was in the independence group. So the next step is that we had our ECIS crash investigation team, and they sought to inspect the vehicle and the scene, really obtaining all possible information, and reconstructed the crash with the ECIS reconstruction team. So you can get a picture of just how big this particular study was, and this was done for all of the crashes that we investigated. And the whole idea was to sort of collect every piece of information we possibly could, and we had secondary sources of information from Victoria Police, ambulance, and so on. And that was a really important part, is that we could actually reconstruct the crash in really great detail and cross-validate all of our information, which is a really important part of the study as well. Just by way of also further introduction, our control arm, one of the things that we wanted to do really was to look at speed. We know that from past research out of CASA, Craig Cloden's magnificent work, we see that the risk of crash involvement is related to travel speed. We wanted to replicate that study, and this was a major part of what we were to look at. So one of our ECIS control team would go out to the site of the crash, as I say, on the same day of the week, within the 30-minute window of the crash occurring, and record all of the vehicles that were travelling past with a laser speed gun. And importantly, that was done in a very covert manner. And also in the post-processing, we were able to see whether or not people visibly changed their speed because of the recordings on the camera. So there was quite a process, and one of the really significant things is that the team at MUARC would then package everything up, send to the Transport Accident Commission, who would then send a very extensive survey to the people who we had recorded travelling through that crash site. And Renee Schuster and the team there were really magnificent at the TAC in doing that, and the people would send directly back to us. So the TAC, we didn't have any personal details, so we were able to get complete consent and authority to use this information as well. And that's a really important part, to protect privacy of people. So that's sort of an introduction really to the design of the study. It's a really significant program and took a lot of years, and you can sort of understand the detail, and there's a lot more that is available in the report. In terms of injury severity metrics, one of the things that we did is we had a look at MAS 3+ as defining serious injury, and there's some really important reasons for that. We collected a whole range of injury severity metrics that are classically used and thought about, things like the length of stay, whether or not someone has had an intensive care unit admission, been in hospital for 14 days, discharged to rehabilitation. So we were able to collect all of that information. But one of the things that we used was the AAAM, the Association for Advancement of Automotive Medicine Abbreviated Injury Scale. That's a head-to-toe injury classification scheme that gives an injury rating to all possible injuries that can happen, from rating from minor, so a contusion, right through to a maximal, which is a complete rupture of the aorta, which is technically, well, theoretically unsurvivable. So we look at MAS 3+ because it has some really important links into road safety. Apart from capturing a whole lot of the size and the magnitude of the trauma, it's an objective system. It's correlated with impairment, it's correlated with resource use measures like the length of stay and so on, and it also correlates well with threat to life. So the higher the single injury AIS score is, the higher your probability of passing away. We also use in injury what we call IR curves, and when we do crash tests, and we'll talk a little bit about that, when we do a crash test, the IR curve tends to use with the crash test dummy, relates it to this level of injury. And that's a really important thing when we start to piece together the connection between speed, impact, speed and injury outcome. And that's why serious injury becomes important. And the third reason why we use MAS 3+ is because in the Vision Zero model for a safe transport system, that's the outcome variable. So it's really important that we have really fundamentally good reasons why we use MAS 3+, and that's an example of someone, that image on the screen is a particularly nasty injury. So we have fractures of the femur, for example, multiple rib injuries, that's sort of where we start, and we go up and up, head and spinal cord injuries. So that gives you a rationale as to why we've based ECIS around serious injury. It's not to say that MAS 2 injuries are unimportant, and they are, and they will involve fractures of the tibia, for example. That can really put people out of work. And that's where we join the dots between someone, say, in a weight-bearing occupation who has a fractured tibia. They won't be able to work if they're a tradie for quite some time, so that can be as impairing. So these are sort of the challenges, but we use MAS 3+. In terms of the study itself, we had 400 injured drivers as enrolled in the study. And these particular crashes involve 523 other people. So other drivers, their occupants and so on. And we had a lot of passengers, some pedestrians, motorcyclists and cyclists. And in terms of our crash numbers, because what had happened, there were 2 people, both drivers in 7 crashes that were enrolled by the ECIS research nurses, and when we put the piece of the puzzle, we realised we actually have the full thing. So we end up with 393 crashes, which is quite unique. 17 people had died in 16 crashes, and there was very sadly double fatality. It's all bad, and 548 other people hospitalised for various lengths of time, and we can see the dates over which it was the study was functional for. Because of the nature of the Melbourne and the Alfred, the major trauma centres, both of them with helipads, the study drew crashes from across Victoria, and this is a really important part. We didn't have exclusion limits on age of the driver. We didn't have exclusion limits on where it happened, or the time of day. We wanted to get a real picture from across Victoria, all of the crashes that had happened. And we can see here that of the drivers that we enrolled in the study, we see the split between males and females and across all of the different age groups. And there's a lot of detail around its its representativeness of the hospital sample, but it's really important to realise that yes, we have a full battery of people from across the state. And in terms of the age range, we have people from 18 to 93, and the mean age was 49. So we have a really significant source of information that we can start to build. In terms of the outcomes, I think this is sort of where we start to talk about the injury severity. We can really see some really significant differences. So around half of our sample have that MAS3 plus level injury. So this is a really profoundly injured group of people who will be with the TAC for quite some time and have significant resource and medical treatment interventions required within the hospital setting. And even we've had a lot of our patient came in on air ambulance, and that just gives an indication to all of you just how severely injured our drivers were. So these are very severe end crashes, but one of the really important findings is that while a third of our crashes, or 37%, happened in rural Victoria, we can see that those are significantly more severe. And that's a really important part of our finding of inner regional and outer regional and remote Victorian crashes have a significantly greater proportion who are injured at that MAS3 plus level and the MAS2 level as well. That's really important because that gives us the start of how we can actually understand where the severe end crashes happen, and we can see that that aligns, unfortunately, with the people, the proportion of people who are killed is very much in rural Victoria in terms of passenger cars. We have quite a significant crash classification system, and we really have three crash types that we looked at in detail: lane departure, across path and rear impact crashes. And we can sort of see here from these charts that injury severity differed by crash type, and so too did the length of medical care. So we can see that that MAS3 plus injury is really tied in tightly to the length of time, the length of treatment. And if you're in the Alfred or the Royal Melbourne for more than a week, you know, that you're very severely injured. And we can see here that the lane departure crash has a very high proportion of people with MAS3 plus, and across path and rear impact crashes a bit less because of the nature of the type of the impact, but also the speeds at which the impacts are happening, and we'll come to what that means for injury severity. A thing really to point out in this is that head-on crashes on straight sections of road are incredibly severe. So in terms of our lane departure crashes, we've coded crashes in terms of off to the left, off to the right, and head-on crashes on straight sections and on curbs. And we can see that for people involved in head-on crashes, 60% require rehab care, and that's beyond the average length of stay of nearly 2 weeks. So some people are in rehabilitation care for a really significant period of time, and the hospital length of stay range from 2 to 43 days, which is remarkable, and intensive care as well. And we can see too that regardless of the crash type, the people with MAS3 plus injuries have significantly longer length of stay, and again 2/3 of those individuals require additional care either in another acute facility or also in a rehabilitation hospital. So we start to get a picture for where, at a very high level, the sort of injury severity that we are managing, and what the TAC then have to work through in terms of its claims side of the business and in managing people to optimal recovery or maximising their independence. Now, I think one of the things now is if we turn our attention to the crashes in terms of how they happened. So given a flavour of the injury severity and by different crash type, and we code different crash types. One of the things, I'm talking now about the 393 crashes, and we went into a lot of detail in terms of driver-based factors, vehicle-based factors and road-based factors, so human, vehicle and environment. And I think one of the things that was really striking was that in all but 2 crashes, we were able to identify a driver-based contributing factor. And people can have more than one, and we've got these listed, and I'll go through the detail of these. But we have what we've classified as performance failures, and that includes driver error. We've got health and driver state factors, and I've got slides for each of these, and also non-compliant behaviour. And we can see, excuse me, and we can see quite significant differences across the different crash types as to the underlying contributing factors. And people can have multiple factors. So a performance failure may be accompanied by a health and driver state, so a medical condition or fatigue or a non-compliant. And we can see, for example, that in a lane departure crash, they tend to have a higher proportion of all 3 of these particular driver-based contributing factors. There were only 2 instances where the vehicle failed, a complete mechanical failure of the vehicle that led to the crash. That's, we think, really important. And we had cars ranging quite old, from the 60s. We had a number, just a couple, but all the way through, and I've got some information on our year of manufacture of cars. But we also know that we've collected a lot of information also around the road environment, road surface and so on, and that's all in the report as well. But I think one of the really interesting parts of it is that in 99.5% of crashes, there was a driver-based contributing factor. So we need to think about that in terms of how we operate the system. What does the vehicle do and what does the road environment do? And we'll certainly be coming to that today. In terms of driver error, so if we split our performance errors, if we split our performance failures into various components, we can see that driver error was identified to be a factor in just under 60% of crashes, and we can see that that does vary. So we can see things like looked but failed to see, judgment errors, so gap judgment errors, and we can see people who just said they failed to see the hazard or failed to see the signs. And we have a range of other behaviours relating to the driving task. So we can see that that accounts for around 44%. We can see that inappropriate gap, and that's much more common in rear impact crashes. And we can also see driving adverse to conditions. And that's normally people who are driving within the speed limit, but people who may not be taking consideration of either the wet surface of the road, and there may be issues with that aspect, but also in terms of the road surface condition, but also the shoulder and so on. So they're driving in a way that we would consider to be adverse to the conditions. And unsafe actions, and these are really decisions to pass, turn, driving in an opposing lane and lane changes, which we would have considered to be unsafe, and that's actually led to the crash. And we can see that there are differences. And I think one of the findings we always think about is driver inattention, and we spent a lot of time on this, and we can see here people attending to things outside of the vehicle but not actually on the road. That's actually quite important as a factor. And one of the really important things is preoccupation. So we don't often think of inattention in this way, but preoccupation, and there's a range of things around that. Activities in vehicle, people eating, people doing all sorts of activities in the car, and passenger interactions as well also turns up. And technology, and our mobile phone use accords with the work of CASA, who've also published in this area, but it is higher actually in rear impact crashes as well, and in more severe crashes, and we think that's upwards of 8, 9, 10%. So we see that that's actually really an important finding as well, of how that all comes together. And what I will say is that is confirmed deliberate handling of the phone, and that's important in terms of its use. So some people might think that's low, but we were quite very careful in how we were able to quantify that, and that's important, but it does change according to the type of crash that occurs. In terms of health and driver state factors, I think one of the other parts is when we consider how crashes happen, we always hear of driver error, but there's a whole range of other factors that influence people, and some of these are very significant. Acute transient illness, so people who have the flu for a few days, who are really incredibly unwell. Medical conditions, and the medical conditions range from confirmed cases of uncontrolled diabetes, cardiac events, stroke, TIAs, transischemic attacks, the effects of cancer and treatment, epilepsy. And those are the range of medical conditions that drivers have and they're driving with. And one of the other really, I think, very important findings is mental health and psychological distress. And we see that for a host of reasons, how that manifests as well, and a small proportion of deliberate self-harm as well, of confirmed self-harm, which is terribly sad. We also have situations where people get in their car after arguments with spouses and family members, go for a drive and clear their head. We have a number of those. So this is an important part of our society that we need to look at. And in terms of driver state, we've classified this as drowsy and people who literally fell asleep. Some fell asleep with the cruise control on, perfectly within the speed limit, but for a range of conditions, and things overlap, so medical conditions with falling asleep and so on. It's important to bear in mind that people have more than one. So these are really important health and driver state factors that are very important in leading to crashes happening, and can be sudden in their onset as well. In terms of non-compliant behaviour, there's some really important findings here. Failing to yield, i.e. failing to give way, and this is deliberately non-compliant behaviour as opposed to fail to see, which is classified in driver error, and disregarding an instruction, which is red light, give way, sorry, a stop sign. The failure to yield can fit there with the give way sign. One of the other aspects too is, of course, exceeding the speed limit. That's our single most important non-compliant, our single highest factor leading to crash involvement. And we can see that the exceeding the speed limit by those particular categories. It does actually change according to the crash type. So it's higher in lane departure crashes. And exceeding the speed limit, importantly, is much higher where the crashes are more severe. And that's actually something that we draw the line from travel speed, impact speed, injury severity, and we have a lot on the performance of the vehicle that we'll show you today. One of the other aspects is alcohol and or illicit drugs. And in terms of illicit drugs, we can see we have not just included the 3 prescribed drugs. We also include GHB, cocaine, other heroin, other substances as well, all showing up in these particular crashes. And this is, when crashes happen, it's either one driver or both drivers. So one of the involved drivers is exhibiting these behaviours. And I think that's really important. We can see BAC, so alcohol alone is 7%, illicit drugs is 8% alone, and the combination BAC and illicit drugs is actually 4%. Again, more common in lane departure crashes. In fact, nearly all of the BAC plus illicit drugs were in the lane departure crash. So we can see that there's some really significant behaviours here. It's important not just, that we understand the full complexity of behaviour in terms of performance failures and all of the subtypes, health and driver state factors, which are incredibly important, and also non-compliant behaviour. And this is a really important part, and it has really significant effects. Exceeding the speed limits as they are currently set, of course, leads to even more serious injury for those involved. And that's actually a really important point. And it takes us to sort of an important part of our results today that we'll describe in detail. So in terms of historically, we think of travel speed and crash risk as the work of CASA. And I think this is something that we've tried to look at, well, we have looked at here in terms of our case control analysis. And basically the fast fact is this: travel speed and exceeding the speed limit is associated with crash risk. We've actually quantified that, and these are crashes that do not involve alcohol or drugs on any of the drivers involved. And if any of the case drivers had indicated that they had used drugs or alcohol, if they had had a drink in the couple of hours prior to us seeing their travel speed, or they had consumed any illicit substance 12 hours prior, we actually excluded them. We didn't want our analysis to have that confound, and we've also adjusted for age and sex in terms of the drivers involved, both of which are related to crash risk. We'll be talking about that in our series of ECIS reports. Key finding really across these crashes is that the notion of only a little bit over, well, it actually does matter. We see a 25% increase in crash risk associated with 3 kilometres over, and we've reconstructed these crashes in great detail. We would consider this to be quite conservative. We were extremely careful and have lots of processes in place, but that's where we've landed. And in terms of our crash risk, we see a 44% increase by travelling at 5 kilometres an hour over the limit. And that's really important because these crashes are across all road types, all speed zones. We have a large proportion of our crashes in 60, 80 and 100 speed zones, but across all road types as well. But and also night and day, and we have around 10% of our crashes were actually at night time. So these results we think are profoundly important, and it shows, as I say, that increase in crash risk, and we do spot differences across lane departure and across path crashes, and that detail is actually provided in the report as well. So we do see that doubling at 10 kilometres an hour over the limit across these crashes as well. So it doubles your crash risk by going 10 kilometres over that. But we do see that increase even at 3 kilometres. So that only a little bit over idea needs to be really thought about and really communicated to drivers that yes, it actually does matter. And we'll come to why it matters even more in the next few slides. In terms of we talk about how injuries happen, and I think one of the really important findings here is that this is an injury risk curve. So we can see that as opposed to travel speed, we're now talking about impact speed. So we're talking about the impact point at which everything happens. And we can see that within our particular sample of crashes, we can see that having a frontal impact crash, 60 kilometre an hour impact, so that's after braking, and I'll make a point about that, is that we can see that the risk of having an MAS 3+ injury is around 50%, and it's higher in side impact crashes because there's obviously a lot less to protect you when you have something coming in at you immediately to your side as well. I think one of the really important findings we have today as well is that 45% of drivers fail to brake. There's just no time. And I think this is one of the myths that we need to really talk about, is that a very small proportion, 29%, attempted to avoid the crash by steering, and that was mainly limited to lane departure crashes where you have more sight distance. But we also see here that of the 55% of drivers who did brake, and this is with the full crash reconstruction, it considers all the drivers involved, of the 55% of drivers who did brake, they could only do so for 1.3 seconds is what our reconstruction tells us. So they've reduced on average their crash speed by 31%. So this is a really important part because our other work also shows that the speed at which people are driving is incredibly highly correlated with the speed limit. So we start to talk about the narrative of the speed limit drives travel speed choice, and that also drives our impact speed, and this is how it all comes together. And this is something that's really important because that's how we start to think about the system, and that's how we start to think about the safety that the vehicle can provide you. So we have provided a whole range of numbers of contributing factors of performance failures, health and driver state factors. These are things that are everyday life things. These are things that happen. And then we have non-compliant behaviour, which we just have to keep addressing all of the time. And that's really critical. But one of the key things, as we see, travel speed is driven by the speed limit, and it has a direct correlation with impact speed, which is directly correlated with your injury severity. And we know that we know that the safety performance of vehicles varies, and I'll come to a really profoundly important finding. But that's the narrative, and that's what we want to make people, hope people really take away and understand, is the picture of how the system actually fits together. And that's what we've really worked towards in ECIS. We know that impact speed also depends on what you hit or what hits you. So not only is what you're in terms of your car, and we'll come to that, but what you hit, and I'm sorry, this slide is quite big, but lots of things are doing lots of things to people. But really, the impact speed is important, but so too is the nature of what hits you or you hit, and the object, and how it all comes together. We can see that 60% of drivers involved in impacts with commercial vehicles have a MAS 3+ injury, and that has a lot to do with mass and geometry and the mismatch with passenger cars. That's really important because it talks about the notion of aggressivity, and my colleague at MUARC, Stuart Newstead, has done a lot of work looking at the impact of vehicle aggressivity and how that's related to injury severity as well. But we also see here quite clearly tree impacts are really significant. And this is really important because, again, a lot of the tree impacts happen on the driver side or the front left passenger side. Cars may not have an airbag, and Australia is very rightly proud of GTR 14, which is Australian Design Rule 85, which is now a crash test for poles and for trees. But we still see at those type of impacts, and we've done some more work, which is not available yet, where really we've looked at the diameter of the tree, its placement to the road, and you don't need a tree this big. A tree this big, this big, you know, that diameter, when it hits a certain part of the car will just look like that, and the occupant compartment, and that's head and chest injuries. So these are really important findings as well. And one of the others, which is really important because it has significant implications for emergency services, is the level of entrapment. So the impact speeds that the cars are having, the damage is so profound that we see that a really large proportion of people are trapped in their car for a period of time, which makes it a lot harder for Ambulance Victoria to actually extricate and deliver definitive care and get them off to hospital as well. It's a really important thing because, again, it's related to the impact speed, and 62% of people involved in lane departure crashes, so head-ons and off to the left and right, were actually trapped in their car, some of them for up to 90 minutes, and that's purely due to the extent of the crush of the car, which is associated with the impact speed. So the point of the story is, at impact, the vehicle is your last line of defence. So all of the contributing factors get you there, whether it's the contributing factor of one or both of the drivers, or a combination of all of them, and we're looking at all the different combinations and pathways. But one of the really important findings of this is the vehicle is your last line of defence, and 5-star cars matter. We see that the proportion of people with an MAS 3+ injury is lowest in 5-star cars, and you can see that there's a pattern there where it goes from 4 stars to 3 stars and below, and we can see how that affects it. And we can also see a really strong association between year of manufacture, and that's also driven by safety improvements, and you can see how the proportion of cars that are rated as ANCAP 5 stars has increased over the generations. Now, a really important finding in this is it tells us something very, very important. is that there are still people who are having significant injuries in the 5-star cars. It's lower than all the others, and we know that the penetration of airbags has increased, of ESC has gone up as year of manufacture has also improved. But we do see that a proportion, 17% of people in the most recent cars in our sample, remembering that our study operated from 2014 to 2016, so there has been an evolution of the fleet since this time, but not by much. We see that 17.2% of people still are having MAS3 plus injuries, and there's a reason for that, and that purely is to do with the fact that the impact speeds that the cars are having is beyond the design criteria. So we spent a lot of time looking at the work of impact speed and how that relates. So let me just talk you through the concept. So the concept is basically you get in your car and you think it's safe. Well, the engineers will create a car based on the current crash tests, which are driven by regulation and driven by the crash tests driven by ANCAP. So there are thresholds. Your car has a natural limit. It's really quite crucial to think about your car as having a certain point beyond which the impact speed, the car can no longer protect you, purely because the shell, the occupant, the crashworthiness of the vehicle just fails. And we've used crash tests by impact configuration to define what that threshold speed would be. So for a 5-star car, that's the current crash test speed. So for frontal offset, which is your head-on, 64 kilometres an hour. Beyond 64, we're saying there's no guarantee your car will protect you from serious injury. So we have a set of heuristics which are designed on your impact configuration, your start of your car, and so on. And what we show here is that there's a very strong correlation, again, with the proportion of cars that are exceeding that threshold impact speed, or what we call the safety envelope of the car, and we can see that that's quite significantly related. So once you're past that engineered in threshold safety level, your chances of being severely injured or seriously injured are much, much higher. Now, importantly, one of the really important parts is that's even higher for people who exceed the speed limit. So that proportion of people who are beyond what we would say is the safety impact speed is much higher for people who exceed the speed limit, because that, of course, is related to impact speed. But one of the really other important findings, of course, is that of the 5-star cars, nearly 42% experienced an impact speed beyond its design or crash test speed. So we sort of see that as really important information about that even the safest cars without correctly aligned speed limits that matches the road infrastructure, that even if we had a fleet of the safe cars with the other parts of the system not joining properly, would still lead to compromised outcomes, and eliminating serious injury would just not be possible. So the alignment of the speed limit actually becomes crucial. So I think the point is, I wrote this down, that even the best currently available vehicles, in those, the observed impact speed is higher than the car can withstand. And that's something that's really important to consider in how we design the system and design the road environment. And we can talk about what that means. Some years back, I had the very great privilege of having Professor Klaus Tingvall as my boss. And he introduced to Australia at Road Safety Conference Vision Zero. And the concept is summed up on this chart, so I'll take a little bit of time to work through what it means. Klaus inspired generations of Vision Zero, and this was done off a lot of work in Sweden in the late 90s and all the way through. And Victoria and Australia adopted the principles as the safe system approach. So this is a really important aspect of us operationalising Vision Zero, or the safe system approach, with the information that we've collected. And this, I suspect, will be challenging to some and provocative to others. but it's really important because it demonstrates the model of putting the system together and putting the system in practice. And with the information that we've collected, of which I've presented some of it to you today, we can see, well, how do we get to zero? Is it even possible? What are the elements of the road transport system? So let me just talk you through that. Vision Zero was introduced by Professor Tingvall as a long-term policy ambition, as a way to eliminate serious injury. And a lot of work, and this particular chart, this graphic shows the design parameters around what the road transport system is and all of its elements. So we talk about the driver and safe driving. We talk about the safety level of the car, and I've shown you direct correlations between impact speed and injury severity, and then again upstream, how that's related to travel speed and how that's made worse by exceeding the speed limit. So start to draw this picture with me. So the speed limit is crucial, and how it all comes together. So these kind of design criteria are really important. And the whole premise is this, that if you have what's called an inherently safe road transport system, no one will be seriously injured at the MAS 3+ level. So we asked the question, is this possible? How does this stack up? What are the design criteria? So we looked at safe driver criteria, where we have people are wearing their seat belts. They're not impaired by alcohol or drugs. They're not excessively tired. So we've set a very high bar here, that they're wearing their seatbelt and they're not using their phone, because they have to be attentive when something happens to address the emerging situation of the crash. A safe vehicle is important, and we've defined that as a 5-star car having electronic stability control and front and side airbags. And the third part of it is safe roads. And depending on the nature of the road, we've defined what the speed limit would be, and this follows work of Helena Stigson, which was done in her PhD in Sweden. So we'd say, well, what should the road look like and what should the speed limit be, depending on predictable crash types. So for example, a head-on crash where the predictable crash impact is a frontal crash, we would say that below 70 kilometres an hour, 70 kilometres an hour below, we would expect a safe car to protect you, as long as the driver's also compliant. So this is how we put the pieces of the system together. So we would expect that a speed limit of 70 kilometres an hour in a 5-star car with a compliant driver who's meeting all the criteria, if they have a crash for whatever reason, that they would not be seriously injured. Doesn't mean the crash wouldn't happen, it means if it does, they wouldn't have an MAS 3+ injury. That's the elimination aspect. If you desire a speed limit that's higher than that, you have to have physical separation and a safe car and a compliant driver. This is putting the safe system into practice. So we asked the question, well, given our criteria of safe driver, which is defined as all of those things of no alcohol, seatbelt worn, no phone use, not excessively tired, not impaired by prescription medication, which is another part. I'll show you what this looks like for safe drivers. How many people in our crashes were in a safe vehicle, as we defined it as a 5-star car, and also on a safe road according to our criteria of how we match the speed of the permissible travel speed to the impact type to the road infrastructure. So we've embedded speed into, as it is, speed, travel speed and speed choice and compliance is embedded into all parts of the system. It becomes the critical design criteria, and we can see why that's the case in how the crashes happen. So we asked ourselves, of our particular 393 crashes, how well did it go? Well, the driver was the best performing element of the system. Around half of our drivers met all of the criteria. So of the drivers who were involved in the crash, around half. But actually in all of the criteria, 10% of people met our safe vehicle criteria. What we would need to have what we would move towards an inherently safe system where injury is eliminated. In terms of safe roads, it was a quarter. But what we see is something really important here too, is that the less those criteria are met, the higher the proportion of people with MAS 3+ injury. So that's really important, because it's sort of saying the less safe, the high level of the safe driver system not being met, or the safe vehicle, we can see how that directly translates to MAS 3+ injuries. And I guess the question is, from operationalising Vision Zero and the safe system, how does it come together? Well, I guess this is how it comes together when we overlap all three. And this is a really important part, because if we measure the safety of how far we are from eliminating serious injury, first we asked ourselves the question, is it possible? So the concept is really actually elegant, and it's wonderfully simple. If you define the performance criteria of the safe driver, the safe vehicle and the safe road, when they're all 100% met and they're aligned, you have an inherently safe system. The logic is no one will be seriously injured. Well, we had 2% of our 393 crashes where all of the safe driver, safe vehicle and safe roads criteria were met. In that 2%, yes, it's a small number, but none of them had a MAS 3+ injury. None of that 2% were seriously injured. So yes, we acknowledge that that's a relatively small number, but we also have to think about the fact that in 35% of cases, no criteria were met. There was no safe driver criteria, that wasn't completely satisfied, not in a safe vehicle and so on. So we can see if we use these performance criteria as safety performance indicators, we can work our way collectively and concurrently and move our way towards eliminating serious injury. That's the goal, and that's the idea of operationalising Vision Zero and putting the safe system approach into practice. We think that that's really profound, and one of the other aspects too is that we can see that even for drivers who are safe, they're simply not supported by the other parts of the system. Their vehicle and the road environment doesn't support them, so they're not getting that complete overlap. And that's really important in creating safety in our system. We see that there are differences across the different crash types, and we can see that lane departure crashes, which are the most severe in terms of length of stay, we've shown a very high proportion. 65% have to go to rehab. This is a really significantly highly injured group. We can see that that crash type meets the performance criteria the least. So we can start to see how we can operationalise the safe system, put it into practice, and we can understand that eliminating serious injury, once we have all the pieces of the puzzle together, that serious injury can be eliminated. And by successively meeting each of the criteria and the sub-criteria, we can move towards reducing and then, as I say, ultimately eliminating serious injury, which is really the goal of Vision Zero and putting the safe system into practice. In terms of what ECIS tells us, well, I guess we've given a taste today on some of the key results, and the report is large, and there's a series of reports that will be released over a period where we'll be looking at a series of questions. But really what ECIS does is it highlights the really highly injurious nature of crashes and the full range of driver, vehicle and road infrastructure factors that relate to both crash occurrence and serious injury. This information is really important, and it's important to unpack by crash type and location, urban versus rural, by road type, by speed zone. This is the level of detail that we've gone to, and that's the level of insight in how it can be used by people, road safety policy in Victoria to drive future innovation. We can see, as I've pointed out, that driver performance factors, health and driver state and non-compliance all played a role in the occurrence of crashes. We have spoken about the fact that even for compliant drivers, the level of safety of the road transport system, i.e. the vehicle and the road and the alignment of the speed limit to the infrastructure, is insufficient to protect them from serious injury when a crash occurs. We see that travel speed was strongly associated with crash risk, as was impact speed. And I think as a final point, really what we demonstrate in our particular study is by highlighting the complexity of crashes and all of the factors associated, that really what we need is concurrent action in all three elements of the system, that is the driver, the vehicle and the road environment, noting that the speed and the speed limit is embedded within each of those in a very, very crucial way. And as I say, aligning the speed limits with the safety of the vehicle and the road infrastructure, as well as ensuring compliance with those speed limits. So once the speed limits are set correct, we have to have compliance with them. We need compliance now because, as we see, the impact on impact speed and injury severity is higher. But once the system is set, as we say, any breach of compliance breaches what we call the inherently safe system, and there's no guarantee people will be protected from serious injury. I'd like to thank, that's my final point to make. I would like to thank the partners of the study. There are a lot, and the Transport Accident Commission for funding the program and all of their support, but Alfred Health, the NTRI, the Melbourne, our international universities and our international partners, Bruce Corbin at Corbin Consulting, Virginia Tech, Loughborough University and Arizona State, and AFRI through Klaus Tingval. And just my acknowledgement slide, it's large, but it gives an indication just how many people have been involved in terms of the TAC, and I've mentioned nearly all of those individuals from the TAC and Jacinta Evans, who helped with the control study. All of the staff at the Melbourne and at the Alfred, great nursing team whose names are all listed there, and personnel, VicPol, Emergency Services, the Major Collision Group, and the SES ambulance, all the people who've been involved, and tow truck operators who've let our ECIS team access the vehicle on their site, and a full range of people from around Victoria. I have to acknowledge my team. There are many there. They're all in different parts. I'm sorry, the font seems to be tiny, but there are many, many names of people, both our international investigators, our hospital investigators, our academic team, our nursing team, crash investigation, our reconstruction team, control arm team, and all the data and administrative support. Plus the directors of MUARC, thank you, and also our administrative support, Leslie Rees, and our finance team. So that's what I have to present today. Thank you, and I guess our job now is almost started again in how we translate these findings and support the government in translating these findings into policy practice. So that's our task ahead of us. Thank you.